My name is Elise Wulff, and I am here from the Mass General Hospital Aspire program. I'm really looking forward to being with you and your community tonight to talk about transition planning as related specifically to neurodivergent students. Tonight is being recorded, and the goal of that is just as an accessibility option. So if you want to take a second and change your name or your photo or anything like that, whenever I do a recorded CPAC workshop, I always just like to give a moment for people to do that before we get into the meat of the recording. I will have a PowerPoint, a visual guide that will accompany our conversation tonight, and you will get a full copy of the PowerPoint following tonight as well. Tonight's PowerPoint is fully accessible by screen reader, and when I send it out in the PDF format, it will also be fully accessible. So without further ado, I will jump in. So tonight we're here talking specifically about transition planning considerations for neurodivergent students. And the group that we have here is highly likely to be representative of the entire spectrum of neurodiversity across disability categories, across age ranges, across developmental levels, and across family values when it comes to transition planning. So tonight may feel quite dense because the goal is that we actually get something out there for everybody, no matter the age or profile of your child while you're watching this. So think about a goal for tonight being maybe that you take away 1, 2, 3 tips, and then come back and use this workshop as a resource in another 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year, so that you can think about the next step of transition planning. But don't take tonight as a chance to overwhelm yourself even further. Think about 2 or 3 things that might be helpful for you in walking away from tonight. We're going to break transition planning down into a couple of buckets. One is just the big picture. What do we mean when we say transition planning? And then we're going to talk about it broken down into life skills and independence, post-secondary academic opportunities, and employment. And those 3 buckets align with other formal and informal measures of transition planning or the transition planning form as well. I have left time at the end for a Q&A, but of a group this size, I much prefer to take questions throughout. So please don't hesitate to use the chat, to raise your hand, or to take yourself off mute if you have a question or a comment about something I'm discussing. My goal is to make this as relevant for you as possible. The next 3 slides just share where I come from within the larger hospital. Some of you might be surprised to learn that Aspire has an educational consultation wing and an outpatient program for students and children that identify as neurodivergent. So our Aspire programs, we have direct participant options like groups, individualized coaching, parent groups, workshops. But then we also have our consultation, and that's where I have the privilege of being out in your schools, out in our corporations, organizations, and community spaces like religious institutions, libraries, public schools, private schools, Fortune 500 companies, bringing this idea of neurodiversity and some very concrete practices out to make more spaces neurodiversity affirming. So I've used this word a couple of times tonight, and language is a construct. So I am just going to pause and talk about what I mean when I say neurodivergent. So this slide captures how Aspire conceptualizes the neurodiversity framework based off of Dr. Judy Singer's work. So when we think about neurodiversity, we think about the category of neurodivergent, referring to an individual who has been formally diagnosed with a non-visible disability or condition such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, among others, or someone who self-identifies as experiencing the world differently than the average person, hence neurodivergent and neurotypical. Neurotypical refers to an individual who has not been formally diagnosed or does not self-identify with one of these labels. And again, we are also thinking about neurodiversity as your experience of the world. If you are neurodivergent, you experience the world differently, socially, emotionally, organizationally, and from a sensory perspective. The neurodiversity perspective also looks to balance the strengths that come with one of these profiles, the strengths that you have inherent to that profile, not in spite of, and balance that with recognizing some of the very real challenges and the deficits that an individual might feel as a result of their neurodivergence. When we think about that lens when it comes to transition planning, the word I'm going to throw out there now is what I call neuroinclusion. This is a word that's out there already. I cannot take any credit for originating this. Neuroinclusion refers specifically to this idea that the way we think, that many settings do or do not embrace the true naturally occurring variety of different neurological profiles. So neuroinclusion means we're working to make spaces not only accessible, but actively inclusive for that wider range of neurological profiles. As you're thinking about your student, we want to think about, where does your child experience true deficits? Meaning, as a result of their disability, certain things are harder for them, or there are certain things that they have yet to develop that ability. We also want to think about differences, which is where your child does something differently. There may or may not be negative consequences to it, but they just do it differently. In this situation, how an environment or a group of people perceive that difference matters when we're thinking about post-secondary placements, colleges, or vocational opportunities. And then, of course, we always want to be strengths-based. So you're going to hear me reference these 3 buckets tonight because we address them differently when we're thinking about supporting our students to have maximum quality of life and independence. So I use 2 different phrases for transition planning. We have capital T, capital P, transition planning. That refers to the formal process of discussing, setting goals, and actively putting resources toward your child's life after they leave their high school setting. Then we have lowercase transition planning. That's all the other stuff. That's all the informal work that we're doing to maximize their quality of life, help them understand who they are, find meaningful friendships. Tonight, we're going to bounce back and forth between those 2 things. Some of my recommendations will be about the formal transition planning process related to school or other therapeutic settings. Other ones will just be things I want parents to keep in mind as they're preparing to have a neurodivergent child step more independently into a neurotypical world. We're not trying to turn neurodivergent students neurotypical. We do want them to acknowledge that their neurodivergence is not the average or the standard way of thinking or experiencing in the larger, quote, real world. So in capital TP transition planning for school, the questions that you want to ask your team are, what transition assessments will my child receive through their special education programming? You're also going to look for the transition planning form that gets attached to your student's IEP the academic year in which they turn 14. That will bring with it formal transition planning goals. These are connected to your child's core goal areas of the IEP, but they turn the lens a little more forward. You're also going to talk about what additional transition planning services will your child participate in as a result of their relationship with special education. And you will revisit these transition planning goals in the same annual cycle that you have been using for your child's IEP if they are on one. So I often get asked, what age do you start transition planning? We're going to get to that a little bit in the next slide because I think the new IEP really reminds us there's no age that's too young to think about how your child's independence skills are evolving. And the formal transition planning process in the state of Massachusetts needs to begin the year your child turns 14. That means 2 things. The first one is they need to be invited to their IEP meeting. The second one is the TPF, the transition planning form and transition planning goals, will be added to your child's IEP and be brought up in your annual reviews and other meetings going forward. So this slide is really to encourage you to think about the core pillars of formal transition planning. And as your child starts to become 13, 14, absolutely by 15, ask about what these will look like within your district and for your child. Neurodiversity in behavior often traditionally focuses on this highlighted category of the challenges. Now, within within the larger category of challenges, of course, there's a spectrum of challenge, right? We always have to prioritize the most pressing challenges in the IEP. So when we often think forward to transition planning and envisioning our children's lives outside of high school, it can be quite anxiety provoking because that can often result in a long list of things that you want your child to be able to do. Not all of them will be able to be covered by the public school. The constraints of the laws of physics require that we have to prioritize. So when we think as a school district about what are we really needing this child to develop and build so that they can be first safe and then successful in the real world, we are going to have to prioritize that somehow, often first looking at safety, then looking at things that have high consequences like money management. At the bottom here, you see a bulleted list of where we can start to have more nuanced conversations about a student's skills and their independence. So for example, right now, your child might have a strength that they passionately engage about a subject or a topic. Let's have that start to come into transition planning as well. There might also be times that they really lack engagement. Let's think about, of all of the conversations we could have related to these bullet points, how is the team thinking about where this falls on the list of priorities to address in formal transition planning or possibly outside of school with some other resources? So as I mentioned earlier, the new IEP, I'm so pleased that it really clarifies the importance of student voice. So what you see here is are the questions that were added to page 1 of the new IEP, or I should say kind of rephrased, to clarify that the student is really at the center of this process. I work with many students who can't answer a lot of these questions, and that's really fine, as long as we continue to help them build the skills that will let them better answer them in the next annual cycle. So you do want to be looking out for, okay, in their 3rd grade year, how did they answer these? In their 4th grade year, how did they answer these? Even as young as 2nd and 3rd and 4th grade, we want to watch their answers here evolve. Another recommendation I will give here is that often students, because of their language profile or their profile overall or their age, will hear these questions and say, I don't know. That's a fine answer as long as the I don't know isn't a cover for them not understanding the question. So it can be helpful for you to talk about some of these things with your child. A child as young or 1st or 2nd or 3rd grade, this question of after I finish high school, that's really far in the future. But the version of that when your child is in 1st or 2nd grade might be, did you know that I went to high school? Or did you know there's a high school in our town? Or did you know that your babysitter is in high school? We're pulling out the key vocabulary here and just raising awareness and doing a little pre-education around these goals. The other recommendation is I do want to make sure that school teams are using appropriate accommodations and modifications to help kids access this page. That means, did kids get a sentence frame? Did they get a word bank? Did they get a chance to talk about it before someone scribed the answer? So the accommodations in the IEP also can be and should be given to the child to help them interact with their IEP. I am going to pause here and take a look at the chat. Yes, the learning conversation, metacognition. So metacognition, thinking about your thinking. Absolutely. And I'll say this again, if anyone has joined recently, please use the chat or raise your hand if you have a question or comment related to something I'm speaking about. What you see here on the screen is the transition planning form, or the TPF. These are additional questions and boxes or conversations that are added to the standard IEP the academic year your child turns 14. And this is updated and revised with the same degree of detail as the IEP. This should grow and evolve and become richer and more detailed as your child ages and learns new skills and builds their self-awareness. A tip I have for the transition planning form, you can use quotations to capture your child's direct quotes. And that can sometimes be a nice way for us to capture student voice and incorporate parent or team perspective. What I mean by that concretely could be your child under employment. They might want to be a video game designer. You could, in the IEP, write in quotations, I want to be a video game designer for Nintendo, period. That is hugely powerful because it says this is a direct quote from my child. And then you can also have a line that says, the team has discussed so-and-so's strengths in the area of digital game design and recognizes that blank, blank, and blank. So I often hear teams say, gosh, this kid says this thing that he wants to do. How do we tell him it's unrealistic? Both can coexist until there's an age where they can't, which tends to be 16, 17, or 18. So we're going to do a quick true or false quiz, just as the next part that we're going to talk about is promoting student participation in the IEP process. Because as you've heard just so far in tonight, this really needs student voice. And I argue that it needs often when I say that, I get a lot of pushback like, well, this kid doesn't really know who they are, so I don't know how we're going to incorporate their voice. My answer to that is, you need to have your hand on the pulse of how far away a student's self-awareness is from reality. So if you keep the student voice at the center of the process, you are much more likely to hold yourself accountable for having direct conversations, productive, therapeutic, but direct conversations as a team, with parents, with the student, about making these goals appropriate and realistic for your student's profile and their strengths. So we're going to do some true or false questions. I'm going to show you the question. If the answer is true, you can use the thumbs up reaction, type true in the chat, or take your put yourself on video so we can see. So the first question is, in the state of Massachusetts, students are invited to attend their IEP meeting beginning at age 14 or the year in which they turn 14. Students are invited to attend at a younger age if the purpose of the meeting is to discuss transitional services. True or false? Yes. This is true. I do want to add one asterisk here. You can invite your child to attend the IEP meeting at any point. That does not mean, I'm talking as early as kindergarten. That does not mean they sit and stay for the whole meeting. But if one of your goals, understandably and rightfully so, as you're going to hear me talk about in a minute, is to help your child have an early learning curve for understanding their IEP, and you just want them to recognize that there is this meeting and this is their team, they can come as early as kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And what they do when they attend is the meat of the discussion and the planning with the team. All right, the next true-false question. In the state of Massachusetts, if a student who is 14 or older does not attend their IEP meeting, their preferences and interests will not be considered. Absolutely, this is false. And then the last true or false question. It is inappropriate for students younger than the age of 13 to attend an IEP meeting. I guess I kind of gave this one away a few minutes ago. I get too excited about it. Ooh, so sorry about that. False. Students can attend at any age per parent request. Our last true or false, I was wrong, I had one more. Supporting active student participation in the team process assists students in developing self-determination skills and can lead to more positive educational outcomes, including post-secondary education and employment. This is true. So it can often be quite a vulnerable thing to invite your child into their IEP process. And we do have some research and evidence to show that the more exposure students have in a developmentally appropriate framework, the more transparency they have to their special education and leading to more involvement, it does improve their post-secondary education and employment outcomes. Things like their ability to get and maintain a job, how they rate their quality of life. So one of the takeaways from tonight, depending on your child's age, could just be for you to think about what's the next phase of transparency in bringing my child into their IEP process. So when it comes to thinking about the considerations for participation, we have a whole workshop on students participating in the IEP meeting. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but it is relevant as we're thinking about transition planning, because there's no way for students to be able to quickly and on the fly visualize their future if they haven't had good education about who they are and their disability. So when you're thinking about how, where, when, why your child might participate in their IEP process, these are some of the things you want to think about. Their age or developmental age, where are they in the disclosure experience, meaning learning about their disability? If on Sunday night they learn they have autism, probably sitting through an IEP meeting on Monday isn't the best use of everyone's time. Are they in a place where they're angry about their disability? That is a natural phase that many students work through. We might think about a more flexible IEP participation during that phase, their processing speed, and also the content of the meeting. 3-year reevals are a lot. That might not be the best intro for a student. The graphic you see here is from a website called imdetermined.org. This is what I think is the gold standard in terms of a resource for parents to promote IEP participation for their children. They provide leveled graphic organizers, template PowerPoints, template letters, resources for parents, scripts for how to have conversations with your child about their IEP. So I highly encourage you to check out this website, and I'm going to put it in the chat. imdetermined.org. It is free, which is probably why I like it so much. And as we've talked about, the spectrum of participation could be everything from providing their feedback to trusted adults in advance of the meeting, to being there, and then even attending. How much do they attend? What do they say? What do they listen to? Are they expected to respond or just sit there? And then attending the meeting in full. You do want to think about, based on your child's profile, actively moving towards more participation. So perhaps setting incremental goals throughout the year about what we can do to help your child more actively participate in a future meeting. There are also many things that your child will need to be educated about in order to participate in the IEP process. So if you think about your own learning curve as a parent/case manager, there was a lot you objectively had to learn about the process. Probably felt a lot like building a bike while you were riding it. For your child, especially given a neurodivergence profile, we need to be more mindful about spacing out this learning and giving them the advantage of explicit instruction about the IEP process before we start to plug their personal data into it. For example, you might want to show your student a blank IEP. You can print them right off the DESE website before you show them their IEP. You might want to show them an eligibility flowchart before you show them their eligibility flowchart. So I'm going to pause there because everything that we've talked about so far, which has been quite lengthy already, are the precursors to transition planning. Everything we've talked about, disclosure, participation in the IEP process, that's the foundation on which we build effective transition planning. So let me pause and ask for any questions that I can talk about what we've discussed so far before we get into specifics for transition planning. And again, raise your hand, take yourself off mute, or put your questions in the chat. I value different processing speeds, so I am going to move on. But if something comes to you or you're still typing in the chat, please know that I will respond immediately once I get that cue. So let's talk about capital T, capital P transition planning now. When we're thinking about ultimately getting to self-advocacy, a huge, huge, huge skill that's really the bedrock for independent living on any level or supported living is self-advocacy. Because the distinction we're making in transition planning is that we're peeling away the proactive support of adults, right? We're peeling away adults really being the minute-to-minute initiators of your child's support. And to do that, we need to build self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is built on self-determination. A student having the desire to help themselves, which is built on self-awareness, the knowledge they need help sometimes. So pause for a second and think about, where might your child be? Are we in the learning who you are and that sometimes you're going to need help? Are we in the let's have a positive relationship with help? Are we in the how do you get help? Those buckets can be really powerful IEP goals before we actually get to transition planning. Do they have functional communication for self-advocacy? Do they know the patterns of their stress triggers? Do they know when they're really stuck in a really funky social situation and they're going to need some help to get themselves out of it? Or do the adults see that and come in and swoop? The swoop is the piece of transition planning we really have to start to work against. So this self-awareness that we're building, often in schools, we talk about students building self-awareness for other people, but really the goal of building self-awareness is for yourself and your ability to interact with others. Some students that I work with will independently interact with others in the workplace. Other students I work with will always have an adult to keep them safe and to care for them and to help them manage their language and their needs. But everyone across that entire spectrum needs to have the benefit of adults willing to talk to them about who they are. That can be scary. I work with a lot of veteran clinicians who find themselves scared to talk to kids about their disability, scared because it might be emotional, scared because it might be vulnerable, scary because they might not have all the answers. But that willingness to embrace what might feel like fear or vulnerability is one of the best tools that you can have. Think about how you could push yourself to have a transparent relationship talking with your child about their disability. And also think about, as we talked about, what you know about the IEP process. Based on where your child is, how can we make the idea of offloading this case manager role to them feel measured? Feel organized. If you're like most parents I work with, your knowledge of how to be your child's case manager lives all up here. It's heavy, right? But it's up here. You know it, you're organized. You want to start putting things on paper. You want to start writing out your child's care team. You want to write out their primary care physician, their therapist, anything that you know about. You just want to start to get it out of your head and onto paper, because your child is going to not hold it in their head. Core considerations for transition planning. We want to think about your child's health and wellness. So think about where they are right now. What's their diet? What are their food-related skills? What role do I have to play in getting them physical activity? And do they know who's on their healthcare team? You also want to think about travel and transportation. What are their needs likely to be? Do they understand when you take a plane versus when you take a bus versus when you take a bicycle versus when you walk? Money management. How do they think about money? What role have you played in showing them your own home's money management? Have they ever seen you pay a bill? Or if you're like me, are you on auto pay? And you're like, oh gosh, when was the last time I actually had to write a check to pay a bill? Our digital world is interestingly creating a problem with transition planning, where we're often doing life skills so much more invisibly than we ever have in the past. That's great for us. It's not great for our kids who need to see things. So it might be that you start writing when your bills are due on the calendar so that your child sees that. A lot of this is just passive exposure, but these are the kind of checkpoints I want you to be thinking about tonight. And then leisure. Leisure at most often parents are the ones helping their child access the things that they love, right? I'm going to get you a group or a book or a game. You might want to think about sharing with your child how you work through that process. I notice you've been really building things at home. That makes me think of engineering. The library has really cool engineering books. Let's go together and see if there are books there that you might really be interested in. That's the kind of transparency and modeling that our population benefits from. So this slide I'm not going to get into, but it's a reminder, I'm circling back to where we talked about earlier tonight, that a lot of the formal transition planning process will happen through school, but not all of it. So even in our incredibly busy lives as parents and with kids, you do want to think about where you can support your child to build some structured independence. Is that something they can do over an April vacation? Is that this summer? Is there a grandparent or a neighbor who needs their mail brought in twice a week? Thinking about any early exposure, this is Temple Grandin's big thing, any early exposure to real life tasks, volunteering at an animal shelter, picking up recycling, any real life experience and exposure is hugely valuable so that it doesn't feel like a light switch.
So you try.
I'm sorry, 1 second. So that it doesn't feel like a light switch when we're when we flip into talking about the real world, that we're gradually growing our child's exposure and visibility of the real world all along. And then we're just turning the lens to them, as opposed to bringing this whole thing of the real world kind of charging at them like a train. Some examples might be, if you do the Dunkin' drive-through every morning, can your child start to be the one to order? Can your child keep track of how much you're spending there? Can your child help you make the grocery list? Can your child go with you and check things off as you're getting them? If you have a young teen or an adolescent, can your child compare the prices of 2 items and pick which one to purchase? And then there's household chores like laundry and just keeping sight of moving those forward. So let me pause there before we move quickly into the second category of what can you do for school after you leave high school? Questions or things I can answer. Okay, well, don't hesitate to chime in whenever you have them. So I think probably the top 3 questions, one of the top 3 questions I get asked is, what are the options for my child after graduation or a diploma or however their high school experience plays out, 18 to 22? There are so many more than we talk about in New England. We're in an interesting geographical bubble. We're a quite intensely academic region. And because of that, the automaticity of the idea of college creates a problem in special education. Um, because it means there's a higher kind of differential, a greater differential between special ed kids that can hack it and go to college and kids that have to do something else. And I really don't agree with that. We have to look at the options after high school as more evenly weighted, because I do see kids push through and get to college and not be happy and not do well. That's a much harder place to work from than being willing to break the mold and think creatively before jumping right into the college track. I have a question in the chat. Is there a comprehensive checklist to make sure we cover all the basics for independent living? Yes, I think it's coming up in a couple of slides. So in this slideshow, I have, this is an example of a college readiness checklist. So this slideshow tonight has these examples for you to go through and ask your child. There are also formal and informal assessments. In the follow-up from tonight, I'm going to send you a couple of websites that have checklists, questionnaires for you to take as you're thinking about your child, or for you to engage directly with your child. So yes, they absolutely exist. If your child is in the 14 to 22 range, ideally at some point they should have a formal transition assessment. That could be a great conversation to have with the school. What formal transition assessments happen here through special education? Or where could you look to get one done outside of school? But at some point, once a student turns 14, between then and the time they leave the high school setting, I do like to see them have the benefit of a formal transition plan, formal transition assessment. Yes. So think really creatively about what your child can do after their high school experience. Could they live at home and take one course at a local community college that they're super interested in? That's a great way to help your child build the executive functioning skills of taking a course, and they're really interested in it. So that's a fantastic idea before they have to go take all those prereqs that aren't the reason they decided to get an engineering degree. Could they start on a 2-year track? Could they look at a certificate program? Could they enroll in a formal gap year program? There are many emerging gap year programs specifically designed for neurodivergent students, where we're continuing to build that social momentum, those independent living skills. Could they look at a college degree? And there are so many others. So really think creatively. And I'll say it again, it is better to think creatively than to push ahead and wind up in a situation where your child has experienced lack of success or real dysregulation. So what you see on this slide are 4 individuals that might be on a more independent living track. We're also going to talk about individuals that will remain in the supported living setting. So post-secondary readiness, meaning what do you think about when you think about, is my child ready to launch in whatever launching looks like for them? You want to think about, have they ever lived away from home? How do they balance multiple priorities? How's their executive functioning, their social profile, their health and wellness? These are the sneaky skills that make college or independent living not work. I work with a lot of students who are really, really bright, and their independent living skills have just never really been put to the test. Those students really struggle to transition to independent living because they haven't gotten great feedback about the value of exercise, or you do have to talk to people that are not online. Or if you're living somewhere without a parent and you get stressed, what do you do about it? So the idea of leaving the high school setting is about so much more than just checking the academic boxes. It's about you as the parent really having some active planning about how we're going to build their independence in these domains. Could they spend a weekend away with a relative somewhere and see how it goes? Then could they spend a night in a hotel room? I don't mean to continue to use examples that cost money. You can be incredibly creative here, but you do want to think about building opportunities to kind of test how they're showing these independent living skills before we then layer something like college or academic expectations on top of it. Again, this checklist is in here. This is a college readiness checklist that's designed for you to collaboratively take with your child. And the last bucket for tonight, which I'll just get into, is how to think about employment. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So when we think about employment, I do want to share that the employment landscape right now and for the last 10 years has been incredibly challenging, specifically for the disability community. Autistic individuals are consistently at the top of the highest unemployment rates. And some of that has to do with the social expectations of an interview. So this is something that professionally we're really talking about and working on. But I do want to share with you that even for a child who was very successful, kind of quote, blending and fading in middle school and high school, the way that people often get jobs now is through a social interview. And so that can be something to really help your child build up interview skills, first impressions, introducing and meeting new people once we start at age kind of 14 or 15. That's a skill that we really want to build, just so that the options of the workplace are available to them. So I mentioned earlier that some of the post-secondary options I was describing, like college or an associate's degree, may not be relevant to all people with disabilities. So I want to talk a little bit about the full spectrum of employment. So in what we would call kind of the most restrictive category, this is what we call supported employment or sheltered employment. This is where an agency creates a work opportunity for a group of adults with disabilities, and it is highly supported. And it's also a self-contained environment. That's why it's often referred to as sheltered employment. Sheltered employment means that this group of individuals works through a highly structured task with high adult support and supervision that's incredibly flexible. That's a phenomenally empowering opportunity for a lot of adults, where that is huge progress in a step towards independence, in self-determination, in contributing to your community, in structuring how you spend your day, in bringing you out into the world, and building positive social connections with other people. So it can be very exciting, and I encourage parents to look forward to sheltered employment. This isn't a less than. This is a huge opportunity for your child when they're an adult. And that is for a profile of individual, a profile for an individual with a disability that will require that degree of structure and oversight. Sheltered employment does not often require that the individual go through an interview. Again, all of this is facilitated by an agency, and your adult's enrollment in that agency is where we're getting access to these sheltered employment opportunities. It would be highly unlikely that a parent could facilitate sheltered employment on their own. The next model that we want to talk about is called Choose, Get, Keep. This is for individuals who don't need the sheltered employment level of support. What we want them to think about is that they choose their employment, they get it on their own merit, and they keep it with support. So for individuals that are working a step beyond sheltered employment, though that's the model we're aspiring to. They choose a job that they like, that they're curious about, that will fulfill them. They get it because they have the skills needed. We've supported them, we've trained them, we've done interview prep. They get the job, and the right supports are in place for them to keep it. This slide is more of an FYI for parents to understand how we think about employment in the disability sector. The least restrictive employment option is an inclusive workplace, or what we call competitive integrated employment. That means that individual with disabilities applies through the same or similar channels as the general population, and they access reasonable accommodations under the umbrella of the Americans with Disabilities Act to get accommodations to get through the interview process, to achieve a position, and then to stay in that position. We're always aiming to match the individual with the just right level of support. So that might mean that your child should do some supported employment programs before we really think about having them apply off of Indeed or LinkedIn. Here are some skills very concretely to be thinking about under each bucket of vocational transition planning. Pre-vocational transition planning, as I'll send you, there are some assessments. You want to think about, could they shadow or volunteer different types of positions? What jobs can they have within their community, and how are they doing it on chores at home? Because pre-vocational skills are things like, can this student do 3 steps on their own? Do they know where to go to get help? Will they ask for help? Can they navigate in different environments independently? That's all before they're even thinking about a job. So this pre-vocational transition planning is kind of 5th grade to 9th grade. Then there's vocational planning, which is actually thinking about the skills in the job setting, not just the precursors, but the skills in the job setting. That's where we're going to help students build a resume, build a cover letter, get references and letters of recommendation. But those skills, as you can see, are more specifically connected to the workplace. This slide, these are some of the questions I encourage you to think about when you're in your IEP meetings or connecting with IEP teams about what goals we could and should be writing. Because in the workplace, these are the skills that will allow them to have the choose, get, keep model. How do they manage their stress approaching a new person? Do they know their personal triggers and the effective strategies? Even asking the team, how independent is my child compared to what you should expect them to be doing? Other conversations to have when it comes to social communication. Do they understand the different levels of relationships? Because you need to treat your boss differently than a coworker, than a friend. Can they take another person's perspective? How do they respond to feedback? So again, these are pre-vocational skills. These are skills that can be IEP goals that are really important to choosing, getting, and keeping meaningful employment. Similarly, executive functioning. It really surprises me how late in school students can get before they're expected to manage their own schedule. So if your student gets support from a teaching assistant, it's really good to ask at the IEP meeting, does my student manage their own schedule, or are they told where to go and when? Other things like when they come home with homework, if they come home with homework, how do they think about what to do and in what order? Their self-awareness, this is going to really be a collaboration between home and school. Do they know who they are? Have they heard their disability label? Do they know what that profile means to them? As Dr. Shore famously said, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So we want them to understand not only their diagnosis, but a deeper level of detail and nuance on what that means for them. And lastly, this slide really helps us think about the transition to employment if your child is above the age of 14 or 15. This is where you want to think about what building blocks could we put in place for them. This is also when your child leaves the high school setting, making sure that you feel like you can educate them on things like their rights in the workplace. It's quite common that when I'm working with an adult, that their parent or caregiver will really want to talk to their boss. And that's not going to happen. And I really try to share that pretty openly with parents, because I think that it can be hard to acknowledge that there will be a point where people can't talk to you about who your child is. And that often comes sooner than we think it does. I want to put in a plug here for supported internships. This would be connecting with the Massachusetts Rehab Commission or other state-based agencies that offer supported employment, and doing that as young as 18, 19, or 20, so that your student really has opportunities to get feedback from a clinical professional, someone trained in their disability style, so that they know how to translate the feedback from the workplace in a way that makes sense to your child. That's a fantastic, powerful growth opportunity that if we can get 2 or 3 of those by the time they're 24 or 25, they might be in a really strong position to then look for their own independent employment. I really want to thank you for your time tonight. This was incredibly dense. I just want to take a second and pause and capture, kind of go back to where we started tonight, which was this is designed for the K through 12 wide range of profiles, because we're talking to a CPAC community. So know that some of what I said tonight may not at all be relevant to you. And think about which pieces are meaningful and relevant for your family and your child right now. And then feel free to revisit this webinar and this PowerPoint, as well as the links I send you in a year from now, in 2 years from now. So it should function as kind of an ongoing resource. Don't jump off the deep end, but this will be a 2, 3, 4, 5, 10-year process of you thinking about your role in supporting your child in transition planning. So I see some questions coming in. Let me transition to the Q&A part of tonight. Let me show you just the other resources that are available in this PowerPoint. There's more information here about your child's participation in the IEP process, and I will also be sending some links in the email. But let me take my screen share down, and I will get to some questions in the chat. Any suggestions on where we start finding sheltered employment opportunities? That's a great question. Sheltered employment opportunities, a couple of things. If your child is still in the public school system, that would likely come from a Chapter 688 referral, which means that's a referral that the school district provides for your child to transition into state or federally funded resources, DMH, DDS, and all of those acronyms that we use. So I would maybe consider asking the team, is my child eligible for a 688 referral, or does the team anticipate referring my child, doing a 688 referral for my child? On your own research, I would suggest looking at the Mass Rehab Commission, looking at the ARCs. So the ARCs are geographically broken up, but if you just search kind of ARC and then your town, it will give you some agencies. There's another agency called TILL, TILL. But I would start with kind of state-based agencies, because they're really plugged into that network. Which agencies are available? How do we access them? And what ages do they start? So the person who wrote that, could you share a little bit about for which services? Do you mean employment? And what would be the profile of the individual? Feel free to take yourself off mute if you want to answer that, or if you could add that in the chat. While we're waiting for a little more detail there, is there a question from anyone else? Feel free to take yourself off mute or add it to the chat.
Hi, I'm Christina. I just have a question.
Sure.
I know you're going to share a lot of resources, so I'll probably find my answer there. But I do have a soon-to-be 13-year-old, and he's had an IEP for a few years now. Since at 14 years old, I saw that that's when they can join the IEP meeting. I definitely want to start the transition of showing him how to advocate since I've been advocating for him, but just bringing him in. He's aware of his disability. He's aware of that I have IEP meetings, annual reviews, not necessarily all the details right because I have that all. I take care of all that. But yeah, anything that comes to mind, like a tip that maybe I can bring it up to him and prepare him. I wrote down that you said even showing him a blank IEP or any of that sort of thing. But if I'm nervous when I've had the IEP meetings, I can just imagine how nerve-wracking he will be. And I don't want it to be detrimental, basically. I want it to be a
Absolutely.
positive meeting for him.
Yeah, so I would think about what you picked up on. I think showing the blank IEP is a great, more kind of informational way because that document, ugh, we still have a long way to go to make it user friendly, right? But I also wouldn't show it to them all at the same time. So I might start off with goals or maybe the accommodations page. So you could think about think about a logical sequence, right? So if progress reports are coming up and you know that you're going to get a progress report, maybe before progress reports, you show him the goal section. Did you know that a couple times a year, your teachers give me progress on your IEP goals? Would you like to go over your IEP goals with me? And maybe you just pick one goal area, and you do one every couple of weeks. Another thing I would think about is making a visual of all the team members, all the IEP team members, maybe having a grid or even kind of a pie chart where you list all of the people on the IEP team. And I often encourage parents to ask, okay, look at all of these people. Do you know why you see all of these people? Not in a rhetorical way, but really asking, soliciting the feedback of, do they know why they see Miss Wulff on Tuesdays? Do they know why they're in a science class that's smaller than? So those two things in itself could be 2 years of you really spacing out that conversation. I think knowing who's on the team and why you interact with each of them and the goal areas. By the time they're 15, 16, I do want them to know what their accommodations and modifications are because we don't want those to happen too much behind the scenes. So in that situation, again, I think if you were to kind of print or just make a list of the accommodations your student has, you could ask them before the next IEP meeting, which of these do you like and which ones don't you like? So I'm just kind of modeling away. If you think about all the different parts of the IEP, pull all those parts out and go through them in order, but it does help to link them to naturally occurring things, right? Like progress reports or an upcoming meeting, parent-teacher conferences. Does that answer your question?
It does. I have one other, like it's like a
Of
part
course.
two of the question.
Yeah.
What is shared with them? Because you did say they don't stay throughout the entire meeting. So what is
Yeah.
something that is going to be shared?
You you drive that. So
Okay.
if you would like your child to attend before the year they turn 14 or
Mhm,
once they turn 14,
mhm,
I encourage you to reach out to the school team. I
okay,
understand my child would be invited this year. Could we have a brief phone call to discuss what parts they will join? So you do want to have 2 or 3 conversations with the school team
okay,
about what your student will be there for. In the initial meeting, I often suggest that it's introductions
mhm,
and then maybe the student shares some prepared questions about what they do or don't like about school. This is where that website I'm determined is going to be your
yeah,
go-to.
okay,
Maybe they share that and then leave.
okay, yeah,
15, that's 15 minutes. Um, what I'm about to say is a little intimidating, but I think it's a good data point.
yeah,
The year that your child turns 18, unless there's guardianship, they sign their IEP.
mhm,
So if you think about between 14 and 18, that's only 4 meetings. So 4 meetings to have your child be ready to sign their IEP feels like a lot. That's why you might want to think about having your child involved in progress meetings or kind of inflating ways for them to get more experience. Because the year they turn 18, they do need to not only sit through the whole meeting, but be the decision makers of it. Again, unless there's a guardianship or a shared decision making agreement.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for that information.
Sure, thank you. Um, so agencies
Um,
that start at age 15 that help you navigate transition planning. So my email follow-up will have a couple to go to. Kelly Challen Whitmer is a clinician who works out of Nesca. She runs a ton of free transition planning webinars, and I would suggest following her on social media because she gives daily tips that honestly, if you just take her daily tip, you'll get through it all. So I'll share some resources for her. Um, the best place to start is actually going to be starting with your school district and reaching out to them and saying, I'm starting to think more about transition planning. Could I connect with someone who will share with me what resources are available for my child within the district? That's not a commitment. That's, we don't want it all, the school to feel like we're then locking them into all of this. But there is just an information seeking question of what might be available to my student so that you can start to plan what you want to do outside of school. The organization that I work with, Aspire, we do supported internships. We do summer programming that's, travel training, meal prep. There are really good agencies in the area. I can't say that the funding is always covered by state or federal agencies, especially when your child's under the age of 18. Often they are private pay. I'll take one question in the chat, and then I think, Tracy, you had a question. So there's a question in the chat. In your experience, do the kids get increasingly more independent over time with training? How common is it for kids to actually regress as they get older? So it's hard for me to answer that without knowing the profile of the individual, because the trajectory of certain disabilities, perhaps if there's a medical component, there are some disabilities where we would expect an individual to decline based on the nature of the disability. When we're thinking about neurodiversity, if we're talking more specifically about autism, ADHD, or specific learning disabilities, then we should absolutely assume that the right interventions will allow our students to build skills and to make progress. How much progress and how quickly can be frustratingly variable. I do think the examples of if I could call it regression that I see when kids age are have more to do with mental health, meaning that if anxiety or depression really hit them hard, that can lead to quite a regression. I don't typically, that's not really a regression, but I think you could interpret it that way in terms of if they were really holding down a job and then a period of depression hit and it made it incredibly difficult for them to maintain holding a job. But for the most part, I don't see, quote, regression unless there's another variable we're working with. But so I think that's kind of my short answer without knowing the profile of the student. Tracy, did you have a question? I thought I saw you take yourself off mute.
yes, I did. I guess it's a follow-up question to what Christina was asking earlier. So, say your child will be turning 14 at the end of the year. So I guess it would be next year's IEP meeting, and it's their 3-year thing. I know you mentioned, I know by law they're required to be at the meeting, but then you also mentioned that they don't have to stay for the whole meeting. What parts would you suggest that they stay for if it's like the 3-year thing and, you know?
Sure. And let me just let me add a little nuance to one thing. The year your student turns 14, they need to be invited to the meeting. You
Hmm.
can decline their participation. I would highly encourage you not to, but in the interest of being kind of legally clear, the school could invite your child and you could say, no, I don't want them to go. I would think really carefully about not at least taking some version of that opportunity. I think the parts for a 3-year, some of it would depend on how much your child knows about their disability heading into the 3-year. I don't think a 3-year meeting is a time that students should be surprised by new information. So If they know, let's use the spectrum. If they know they're on the spectrum, they're okay with that. Not saying they love it, but they know they're on the spectrum and they're neutral with that idea right now. Then I think having each evaluator pick 2 things they want the student to hear: a strength that came out in testing and something the student should continue to work on. That framework, I think, could be hugely helpful. Now, this is where, again, you're going to need to do some pre-planning with the team, right? Because in order to have your child hear each of the providers say just 2 things, you're then going to have to really, once your child leaves, you're going to have to go back and revisit the details of the report. So I think it's important to start the planning process. It may mean that we do 2 meetings. We do the official 3-year, and then we have a mock 3-year where we structure that a little bit. So I think when it comes to testing, I would approach it that way, assuming your child knows about about their disability. Have each provider give a strength that came out in the testing and an area for continued work, or we can just say an area of challenge, right? That's okay to talk about challenges. If your child doesn't know about their disability yet, I would encourage you to think about why we haven't told them and how we can pretty efficiently take steps in that direction. That often means you as a parent getting the support you need to feel ready to share that with your child. My own practice is really supporting parents to build their understanding of their relationship to their child's diagnosis so that the parent has what they need to have those conversations and join their child in exploring the disability. Tracy, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, one last question.
Okay,
You
no, no, no.
mentioned about guardianship later on when they're 18.
Yes.
What are, I guess, for lack of a better word, what would be the requirements for someone to, apply for guardianship or whatever have you?
Yes. So that's a really complicated topic that I apologize already because I won't be able to give an adequate answer. So there's there's guardianship outside of the educational system, which is when features of your child's disability, we have the evidence that their profile from formal testing or from a physician or psychologist or clinical provider has assessed that your child is not adequately equipped to make their own decisions. That kicks you into many levels of guardianship, though. You can have full guardianship, partial guardianship. That's outside of school, though. Within school, it's going to be a much more defined conversation, things like shared decision making. So if your child is about to turn 18 and the team has evidence that they are not adequately capable of fully understanding what they're doing when they're signing their IEP, or that they're not in a position, we have evidence that they're not able to make the best decisions for themselves. That's when the school team can talk about shared decision making. Both of those are much more complicated than I'm making them out to be now. I would say the bar for formal guardianship outside of school is quite high. You do need to have formal testing, and you'll have to go before a judge, and there's lots of paperwork involved. The school-based process for determining who gets shared decision making or otherwise is also data and assessment driven, but it's not as complicated as formal guardianship in kind of the world outside of school. Well, being mindful of time. Yeah, thank you, Tracy. Great questions. Being mindful of time, I want to thank you all for such thoughtful questions. And I hope that something from tonight meets a need you have as a parent. The resources I'll share following tonight, I hope those are also helpful. But please don't hesitate to reach out if you're looking for something else or if a question comes up. Your CPAC chairs know how to get in touch with me. And I want to thank you again to the CPAC for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to come back to the Belmont community.
Elise, thank you so much. This is Meg, and there's a couple people here in person with me. I was just wondering, could you repeat, and maybe I see Tim still here, how the resources will be shared?
Yes. So I'm going to follow up, Megan, the email chain that we have. I'm going
Yep.
to follow up with a fresh email that will
Okay.
have a copy of tonight's PowerPoint, as well as the body of the email will list links to additional resources.
Great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.